Good afternoon and welcome to session 3. This is the Ed Collab Gathering, workshop number 9 with Rachael Gabriel. Rachael Gabriel is an associate professor of literacy education at the University of Connecticut, and she's the author of Making Teacher Evaluation Work, a guidebook for teachers and leaders, and many more important works in the field. She began her career as a middle school reading teacher, a girl after my own heart, in Washington, D.C. And since then, Rachael's worked as a literacy specialist, new teacher advisor, and reading intervention provider. Please check out her full bio on the Ed Collab site, because we're so grateful for all the work that she's done in her career for the field of education. And today, she's here to speak about demonstrating and finding key ingredients of effective literacy instruction. Share your learning during the session on Twitter with the Ed Collab hashtag, which is hashtag the Ed Collab space number 9, hashtag 9. And if you'd also like to share your learning, you can also include Rachael's Twitter handle, which is @RachGabriel. You can also find that on the Ed Collab page. But now let's welcome Rachael Gabriel.
Good afternoon, or if you're in a different time zone, good morning. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm planning to speak with you about demonstrating and finding the key ingredients of effective literacy instruction. And so I want to share my screen with you here and tell you a little bit about why I plan to think about this topic with you. And then just give you a sense of the session so that you can kind of plan your attention and plan what you're up to on Twitter and other things. So as was just mentioned, the hashtags are down at the bottom on the left in case you want to follow along on Twitter. But we're going to just start by thinking about 4 things that I've learned from studying effectiveness in teaching, which is what I've been doing for almost a decade now. Since I left the classroom, this has really been kind of my mission and my focus, is to figure out how we understand and measure teacher quality in order to support better instruction. And so part of my work has been identifying what I consider the key ingredients of effective literacy instruction, which is different from best practice, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that later, but key in that if they're missing, something's wrong. And if they're not there altogether, it's not literacy instruction. So a couple of kind of quick things to keep in mind. And then I want to talk mostly about these key ingredients in action. What does it look like when teachers are doing them? How do we know when teachers are doing them? How do they demonstrate to leaders or outside audiences or other people when they've got these key ingredients? And then also, how do we protect them? And so that sort of leads into the idea here about why we would bother theorizing what effective literacy instruction is in the first place. Now, I know that not everybody is as excited about teacher evaluation as I am. I got into teacher evaluation because I wanted, as a classroom teacher, to go do a PhD about professional development, because I wanted to know more about how teachers learn and how to help more teachers learn. But the more I read about professional development, the more I understood that the difficulty with understanding how to do it better is that we have to have some way of understanding when teachers are getting better. And as I looked into the literature on teacher effectiveness and the tools that we have to measure it, I was just totally underwhelmed. Like, there are no wonderful tools for making sure that teachers are excellent and getting better over and over all the time. And part of that's because it's really difficult to measure something like effectiveness that's multifaceted. But part of that's because the way we're measuring it, in my opinion, is generally sort of wrong. And so I've been working a lot on researching teacher evaluation practices, the tools we use, and how those kind of set and limit what counts as effective and what can count as effective. And in doing that, some of the work that I've had to do is figure out, what does it look like in process? And then once I know what it looks like, how do I explain that to other people and defend it? So I'm going to come back to this slide for a second. I'm going to put out there a couple of things that I think are key ingredients based on my work, but I want you to think about using these in a couple of different ways listed across the top. The first one is defense, so that you can explain what you're doing to outside observers that want to understand your instruction or are trying to evaluate your instruction. You may need to sort of explain to them how what you're doing matches the best of what we know about excellent literacy instruction. The other side of that coin, though, is sort of using this information offensively, like being able to lobby for materials or opportunities or resources that would help you do more of these key ingredients and make sure that they show up in your classroom more often. And then when you are kind of on the fence about something, when you're not sure if one idea or another, if one approach or another would be best, having these in mind helps educators make quick decisions on the fly, because you have kind of like a core to come back to. And that core is really the last piece of it too, just sort of what we call good sense, as if that's something everybody agreed upon. It's not. But to have your own kind of foundation that would support innovations. So we know that when you get a new piece of curriculum, you're not supposed to do it just as it says on the page. You're supposed to innovate from it, that it's a starting point, not an ending point. But knowing which direction to innovate from and knowing which innovations are good means that you have to have a really clear, principled foundation to be working from. And that's what I'm hoping these key ingredients are. And that's why I'm excited to share them with you today. At the bottom, I left this mostly as a note to remind me, in this era of accountability, with teacher evaluation taking up more and more of our leaders' time, administrators and other school leaders are spending a lot of time judging instruction and measuring instruction. If we as educators aren't good at telling people what effective literacy instruction looks like for us in our classrooms, other people will tell us. I can think of several times in my career when that's happened to me, where someone has come in and told me what's good, and it's something that doesn't jive with what I know or believe or have seen with my students. And I imagine that you listening probably have had an experience like that too, whether it's about something small in one day or whether it's about a whole new approach school-wide or district-wide. People will tell you what it should be if you aren't ready to explain and defend what you know it should be. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I arrived at these key ingredients. And it all comes back to this basic idea that I always share with students when I start in classes. This is something that came out of my work as a middle school reading teacher. It's something that I first started sketching in my very first theories class when I came to the University of Tennessee to work with Dick Allington on my PhD. So this started in the back of my notebook and then kind of evolved into a graphic that I use all the time. And it's basically like an accumulation of what I've seen happen with students mapped onto theories of how reading development happens at all. And the idea here is that we're always stuck in these snowball cycles of reading growth, or we can kind of get a kink somewhere in the cycle and it starts to back up the whole system, so the cycle goes the other way as a cycle of reading failure. So if we begin with the idea that someone needs to spend some time reading in order to get good at it, when you spend time reading, you get practice decoding or recognizing words, which means that you see more words, so you're exposed to more vocabulary. And when you can recognize words and you know what they mean, you can read them fast and smooth enough to understand. And when you understand them, you might like what you're reading and feel the potential to be engaged with it, which means you probably will feel good about it. And then that will give you a reason to spend more time reading. And if you spend more time reading, you get more practice, which gives you more exposure, which helps you read fast and smooth so that you can understand what you're reading. If you understand what you're reading, you might like it. If you like it, you feel good about it. And then you'll spend more time doing it. So you get more practice and more exposure so you can do it fast and smooth enough to understand. And if you understand, you like it. And if you like it, you feel good about it, so you spend more time doing it. Do you see how that kind of goes in a big cycle? So that cycle just repeats over and over again. And that's why when if you have two first graders that are sitting next to each other getting the exact same instruction and the exact same literate environment, and one of them reads for longer or one of them reads a little bit faster, they have more exposure, more practice, and more opportunities to fall in love with reading. And that's why we can kind of see individual differences between kids that have pretty much the same opportunities. That's how we see them show up. Now, the downside of this cycle is that you can get a kink kind of anywhere in it. So if you think about the cycle of reading failure, we're thinking about maybe you pick up a book and there are lots of, I'm waiting for this goofy thing in the bottom to disappear. Anyway, maybe you pick up a text, it's science, it's 7th grade, it's a textbook, and there are words in it that you don't recognize. Well, that slows you down. which means you understand potentially less or have to work harder to keep your understanding up, which means that there's less of a chance that you will enjoy what you're doing, which means less of a chance of confidence, which means you're likely to spend less time. And that cycle kind of keeps going backwards until someone helps you straighten out that kink in the cycle. And that's really how we do it as educators. We're looking for, where's the kink? Can I boost your confidence? Can I help you recognize these words? Can we look for word meanings together? Can I help you understand how to approach comprehension for this piece so that that cycle can keep going fast and smooth? This is just another graphic kind of representation of what would happen in the same classroom where the kids are getting the same thing. 3 different readers would really be getting different practice just based on their individual differences as readers. So if you are following along on Twitter, I want to hear kind of if these readers remind you of anybody. But the idea here is if we give everybody the same text, everyone kind of comes at it a little bit differently. They come at it with their own motivations, with their own background, with their own skill-based fluency. And then we can kind of see how their outcomes would be slightly different, even though the instruction is the same. Now, this isn't news to most reading people, and it may or may not be news to most people that evaluate reading instruction. But it's important to point out that students are getting kind of different things out of our instruction. They self-differentiate just by being different people. And that means that there's not going to be one thing that a teacher does that counts as good instruction, because it's going to hit every kid slightly differently. And really what we're looking for is a positive interaction between each student and the instruction or the opportunity that's provided. So we're not actually looking at, is this teacher a good teacher as a person, or is this student a successful student as an individual? We're really looking for classrooms where the most students have the most opportunity for good reading development opportunities in that interaction between what the teacher has created space for and what the students bring. So to make that a little bit more concrete, here are a couple of things that I've learned. There's way more to good instruction than what meets the eye. If you walk in and observe somebody teaching and it's going very well and students are engaged in their learning, it often looks like magic. It looks like it's easy. And it should be easy. It's a natural thing to do, to want to communicate and educate and work together on things. However, anybody that's done that knows that there's a lot going on underneath the surface. Some of it's conscious, some of it's unconscious, that go into making this somewhat magical thing occur on a daily or weekly basis. So this might be easy to get agreement on, that there's more to good instruction than meets the eye. But we still have policies that basically make this assumption, basically assume this assumption is false. Like policies that say you get observed 4 times and then we make a rating for you and we give you an evaluation rating based on watching what happens in your classroom. So if we have to work on shifting attention away from just what people can see, we've got to keep this one in mind, so hang on to it. The problem here is that a lot of the things that we see in a lesson, I have them listed here on the column called surface features, observable in a single lesson, are not good or bad in and of themselves. So like having a nice short mini lesson, you can have a really unengaging, uninspired, unhelpful short mini lesson. You can also have like a phenomenal short mini lesson. The fact that you had one doesn't really mean anything. It just means that you like had the opportunity to do something good. What we're really interested in when we think about effective practices in the classroom is the underlying process that supported that mini lesson. So is this mini lesson being used to apprentice students into practices that support authentic reading or writing? So when people walk into your classroom, it's not a yes, no, did you have a short mini lesson or not? It's our students being apprenticed into practices that support authentic reading and writing. This might seem like it's super obvious, but I have to tell you that I've worked in more than one place where the observations are focused on how long the mini lesson is, and also that means that the feedback to teachers is focused on how long the mini lesson is. Now, it doesn't come out of nowhere. There's some logic somewhere that says mini lessons should be lean. They should be short, quick, focused, engaging. That's not wrong. But sometimes that translates to administrators coming into your classroom and saying your mini lesson should be a certain number of minutes. I worked with a district last year where that was the case, where 3rd through 5th grade teachers were told their mini lesson could be no longer than 8 minutes. And if it was longer, their feedback was shorten it. And if it was shorter, their feedback was lengthen it. And if it was at 8 minutes, there was no feedback, because administrators were focused on that surface feature, just having a short mini lesson, and they weren't thinking about what are the underlying processes that make that mini lesson worth having in the first place. And so part of what I'm hoping to do today by uncovering kind of the key ingredients is thinking about what makes something like a mini lesson worth having, so that we can get away from some measuring and sorting based on these surfacey features and start the conversation about the things that matter to good instruction, no matter what they look like on the surface. Whether you did it in an off-the-cuff comment or a planned short mini lesson, good instruction can happen anywhere as long as these key ingredients are there. So let's come back to the screen. So number one was that there's more to good instruction than meets the eye. Number two is that educators need specific common language to keep our conversations focused on good instruction. Now, I know that from personal experience, because it's really easy when I come into classrooms to start talking about lots of things that don't have to do with instruction, like that the copy machine was broken, like that we didn't have enough versions of the text for people to all have different levels, that we didn't have this, that, or the other thing. Resources are easy to talk about. Instruction is really hard to talk about. And part of that is because we often don't share common language. People are prepared in different programs, they read different stuff, they attend different professional development, and that diversity is really good, it's important. But it also means that we sometimes don't have the words, literally, to keep conversations with administrators focused on what's important to us. Now, what you see in this chart is a sort of frequency of how often the indicators on these 4 different evaluation rubrics, how often the indicators have anything to do with actual instruction. So the framework for teaching is the Danielson model. This is used in part or in whole by lots of states right now. And about 23% of the indicators on that are related to instruction. There's a lot of indicators spent on things that are supportive of good instruction, but not actually instruction itself. For some of these other tools, the distribution looks a little bit different. The Protocol for Language Arts Teaching Observation, sometimes people call that PLATO, is developed by a group of researchers at Stanford. And because it's focused on language arts, more of its indicators have to do with instruction, but it still has a good chunk that's really just on management, like pure logistics. And those things are important and teachers need support for them, but we also need opportunities and reminders in conversation with evaluators or in conversation with colleagues to be talking about like the actual instruction that all that classroom management was for. So number 2 is we need some specific common language for it. Number 3 complicates this. So the third thing that I've learned from studying effective teaching is there's no such thing as a best practice. There are principled practices, but they look really different when they're at their best. So the 2 pictures that you're looking at are 2 pictures of me doing a workshop with teachers on exactly the same topic a week apart. But in one of them, I did it at a school for the deaf in Haiti, where we were using a chalkboard, where I was using a version of sign language and speaking as much French and Creole as I could. And a week later, I was talking about a similar topic with teachers in the US. This is Hartford, Connecticut. I have, like my ice cold Diet Coke right there and a smart board right behind me. I'm holding printed papers that like have a stapler in them. And I have my sunglasses on. Well, my sunglasses are on my head in both pictures, but that's just because I always forget that they're there. So there's all these things that kind of contextually look different, seem different. I had a different set of resources. I had a different kind of process in mind. However, I was doing the same, working to sort of enact the same principles for professional development in both settings. It just looks really different. So I like to think about this as sort of like going back to the baked good metaphor. Like all of these flavors of cupcakes are really fantastic. They're just different flavors. And that doesn't mean that one is better than the other or that one is the best. But each of these cupcakes has to have a couple of features that make it. It has to have a couple of key ingredients that make it a successful cupcake, even though they can look different in different classrooms on different days with different people. So that's what these are aimed at. I keep talking about this idea that there are key ingredients instead of best practices, because I think best practices gets us stuck into trying to do the same thing over and over again, assuming it will have the same result, which is stupid. So, which ingredients are key? I want to tell you a little bit about how I arrived at the set that I'm going to talk to you about so that you know where they come from. You don't have to just kind of trust me. So 4 years ago, I started on this project. I had just read the checklist manifesto, and I thought, like, okay, I'm going to come up with, like, what are the 5 things, and I can count them on one hand, that all administrators should know when they walk into a room, or that all teachers should know when they begin being evaluated by outside people. Like, I want you to be able to say on, like, 1 thing per finger, not 6 things, not 3 things, but literally, like, you need to have this, 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 and this. And if you have those things, you're in good shape. Because I thought after reading the checklist manifesto that, like, simple, clear would be better than a rubric that, like, takes up 16 pages, or a rubric that is generic so that it's the same indicators for kindergarten and 12th grade for science and for mathematics. It just, like, good instruction is particular and specific. It's not generic, so how could the tool be? So I had this idea that I'd come up with a checklist. I worked with a bunch of colleagues to do this. We did a synthesis of the literature. We looked at effective teachers. We interviewed effective teachers. We looked at all this research stuff, and I came up with, like, okay, if at the very minimum there is reading, writing, talking, strategies, and choice in a reading lesson, you have at least a good foundation to start on. And then I went to a huge set of already rated videos from the Measures of Effective Teaching project, the MET project. And I took my sort of, like, 5-finger checklist to that. And I knew that within these videos, there were some really strong and really weak examples of instruction based on lots of different measures and lots of different opinions on them. And I have the sort of definition for facepalm down in here because basically I had to take that 5-finger idea and kind of, like, throw my head in it. That doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean. It just didn't work. I'll show you why. Because you can have 2 classrooms with exactly the same scripted lesson. So they have the same features, the same observable features in there. And in one of them, the teacher is being very clear and very intentional, and students are using the time to read and write and talk for almost the entire period. But in the next classroom right next door, and I've seen this happen live, they have the same script going on, so it has the same observable features, but teachers are giving lengthy or unclear explanations, or they're stopping a lot for management things, or the materials were in the wrong place or in the wrong order, so time is lost, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the period, students were reading, writing, and talking because they had the same opportunities on paper, but in actuality, they're doing it for about half the allotted time. So what I found with my checklist is teachers in the bottom 5% of this library of 2,000 examples of 4th grade reading instruction, teachers in the bottom 5% of those 2,000 had a lot of the same features as teachers in the top 5%, they just did them differently. So going in with a checklist of is this here, is this here, is this here, the answer is almost always going to be yes. Like, you can find these features in really, really uninspired instruction and in really amazing instruction, but that's not really enough. And so I went back to my drawing board. This is, like, now 3 years ago, and I was like, okay, it's not going to be a 5-point checklist. Maybe I can elaborate the checklist, and I made this spreadsheet, okay? Spoiler alert, this also fails, okay? Making my 5 things into 5 categories that have 3 or 4 indicators, first of all, it puts me in that category with all of the existing observation rubrics that have, like, multiple pages and multiple descriptions for all of these many, many indicators. And second of all, I didn't get any better at predicting whether someone was whether it was good instruction or bad instruction just by checking these things off. So I purposefully made this checklist a little bit blurry so that you could see that it just sort of became like this fuzzy mess that didn't actually tell me any information. So right here, this is my daughter Frankie. She's 3 weeks old. And this is her doing a face palm, because even a 3-week-old should have been able to predict what I wasn't thinking 3 years ago, which is that if I make it more complicated, it'll get better. It actually doesn't need to get more complicated. I was just looking at things the wrong way. The big aha moment for me was that it's not about whether teachers are doing certain things, it's about how they're doing them. And so instead of saying, are they reading or are they writing, I now have this list of active ingredients, which are active because they're done in a certain way. So not just are they reading, but how are they reading? The first active ingredient I always look for is that students are not just reading, but they're reading accurately, which means they have something they can and want to read, and with a purpose. Now, that's basically like saying, you know, I'm baking cookies, but if I don't put baking powder in, they're not going to rise. So now I don't have a cookie, I have like sploosh. So thinking about not just reading, but reading accurately, and not just accurately, but with a purpose, that's like actually putting the baking soda in. Now you have a cookie. Now you can have all different kinds of cookies and all different varieties, but it's not going to be a cookie if you have no rising agent. And I really think about this accurate reading with a purpose as the rising agent. If it's not there, you might have something, but it's not literacy instruction. And that's how I've decided what counts as an active ingredient versus like something that you can add in just for fun. Like you could put sprinkles on top, you could make it a vanilla flavor or a chocolate flavor, but if it's not reading accurately with a purpose, it's not reading instruction. Similarly, if it's not writing with a purpose and an audience in mind, it might be practicing penmanship, it might be keeping track of information, but it's not writing instruction. So there are lots of times in your classroom where you might not be reading, writing, talking, discussing in these ways, but without them, you're not actually doing literacy instruction. I want to leave room for the possibility that you sometimes have to like make announcements. You sometimes have to build community. You sometimes have to respond to things you can't predict. And so you won't always see these things for every second of the day. But if you never see them, then we don't have literacy instruction. So as you are listening, I want you to be thinking about, and maybe even tweeting about it, do you have practices in mind, things that you do to accomplish this goal of reading accurately with a purpose for every single kid in your classroom? And instead of thinking about your instruction as just a collection of practices, like I do Socratic seminars, I do guided reading, I do really wonderful mini lessons. It's not really about the things that you do, it's about whether those things create opportunities for more and more students to read accurately with a purpose, to write with a purpose and an audience, to talk about text with their teachers and their peers, to discuss these models of fluent reading. If your work isn't aiming towards those things, then it might be nice and it might be fun, but it's not literacy instruction. Coming back. So what I'm hoping is that demonstrating these changes from people assuming we can walk into your classroom and know whether what you're doing is effective or not just by using our eyes, just by like ocular proof, one snapshot. Instead, I think people are going to have to ask. So evaluators coming in are going to have to ask you about how what you're doing is accomplishing these 5 goals. The problem is that many administrators are not going to know to ask. And so we have to start to tell them. Instead of saying, I'm doing a Socratic seminar, what you might say instead is, I'm using this Socratic seminar in order to make sure that more students are talking about text with their teachers and their peers. And what you can do to help me make my instruction better is tell me about whether I'm accomplishing that goal. So I don't want a checklist of things that make a good Socratic seminar, because those things are going to be different every day with every class. Just like my workshop in 2 different countries is going to look drastically different, but it's also going to be different if I do that workshop back to back. If I did this same one with a different group of people tomorrow, it should be different, otherwise it's not good. So the point that administrators should be listening for and looking for is not, do you have students with books in their hands? Because even horrible lessons have students with books in their hands. What we want to know is, are those students reading accurately with a purpose? In my first job, I had an opportunity to do a reading volume initiative, and the administrators decided that that they would ask the reading department, what would be a good initiative, and we said it would be great if we could increase the volume of reading. And so the policy became students had to walk with a book everywhere they went so that they would always have the opportunity to be reading. And we got pencils and t-shirts and banners that said walk with a book, and kids got bonus points for walking with a book, and they also got demerits if they were ever found in the hallway without a book. And so it became this thing where kids would just like grab books or trade books or like leave books in different rooms so that they could always have one when they went in the hallway, because if they didn't have one, it was like not having a hall pass. And if you weren't walking with a book, then you weren't being a scholar, which means you would get demerits. So it's just a good example for me of how this idea that like kids should be reading all the time can get really twisted when we try to make it a policy. And I'm worried that that's what's happening with good teaching within teacher evaluation. There are lots of ideas we have about what makes teaching good, but when we write it down as a single indicator, it gets twisted to the point of its absurdity. And we're not going to get any better indicators. The indicators aren't the problem. The problem is that there isn't going to be a single set of indicators. There's going to be a set of good questions, though, that will help people uncover what's important to talk about. But we're never going to have this kind of like 5-point checklist or even a 35-point checklist. Yes, the kid has a book in their hand, but are they reading accurately? Are they reading for a reason? Do they know what they're reading about? Are they talking to somebody about that reading? All of that was the important stuff that you can't really do on an observation rubric. I'm going to come back to the window here for a moment. Okay, so we want to get good at not just realizing when we're doing these things, but also communicating that to other people. And part of what happens when we start to communicate with other people that I'm doing this practice in order to accomplish one of these 4 goals or 5 goals is that we start to question why we do some things that we do. And this is something that I have to make continuous confessions about. There are lots of things that I do as a matter of routine that I forget why I do them, or that I never knew why I did them. I just did it because someone else was doing it and I thought that's how it had to be, or someone told me. But even something as simple as how you open your lesson, what's the first thing you say? What way do you gather students' attention? That can be trained and tailored to making one of these 5 things happen better or more often or for more of the students in the room, or it can just be random. Now, opening a lesson is kind of a generic thing, but even some specific literacy practices, like when we do independent reading, are we structuring independent reading so that everybody reads accurately with a purpose, or are we structuring independent reading so that everybody reads quietly without interruptions? Now, quiet without interruptions is nice to have, but only if it's making room for students to read accurately with a purpose. So we have to kind of think about changing our thinking about our own practice and the way we communicate about our practice to other people. Otherwise, the focus shifts from what's really important to what's easily observable. This requires clear communication. I'm going to show you a few examples of that. The comic is here just as a reminder that what counts as effective in almost any situation, but certainly in the classroom, is contingent. It really depends on your own frame of reference. And because it depends on your own frame of reference, it's not always shared. So here, I think this is Arlo and Janice, but it might be Arlo and Arlo's mom. It's been a long time since I looked at this strip. I'm not even sure it's out anymore. Anyway, he asks what the shirt smells like, and she says it smells like a wet sheepdog pizza with anchovies. Now, I would think that means don't wear it. However, he's not exactly sure what that means because he didn't ask the question that he really wanted an answer to. He didn't want to know what it smelled like. He wanted to know, should I wear it or not? And because he didn't ask the question that he really wanted an answer to, he got an answer that didn't make sense to him. And I feel like that happens to me when I talk with evaluators about my own instruction. And yes, that still happens for people in higher education. And when I hear other teachers talking with evaluators about their instruction. We ask questions like, how did it go? Or how was it? What did you think? Do you think this worked? Was this okay? What could I do differently? Now, all of the questions in these columns are like humble, and they are open to criticism, and they are like open to feedback, and are really nice questions to ask, but they're not actually the question you want the answer for, or there isn't really an answer. How was it? It was, what one word could somebody say that actually helps me with my instruction? What did you think? I don't really care what you were thinking about. I want to know how to make this better, which means I need to ask a specific question about it. I first learned about this a long time ago, so long ago that it's embarrassing I didn't apply it to reading instruction until now. But my very first job in high school was as a waitress in a sort of a fine dining cafe that was inside the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And we had scripts, of course, for what we were supposed to say when we approached a table, and what we were supposed to say once they had their food, to check to make sure that everything was going okay. Now, I didn't want to know how is everything, because I don't want to know, like, my foot hurts, my face itches, why my water glass is sweating too much because of the ice cubes in it. Like, I don't want to know about everything. And I also don't want to give patrons the opportunity to think about what every little thing that could have been wrong, because there's only a small number of things as a waitress at the moment that I can fix. I really can only fix your enjoyment of the food. And so what you're supposed to say when you go up is the specific dish and how are you enjoying it. So how are you enjoying your Arctic char? Because that's specific enough that if you don't like something about it, I can switch that out. But if you just kind of are like, it's fine, then that's fine. I didn't get information, you didn't get information, nothing about this meal is going to change. Too general. I guess I learned that lesson in order to be a good waitress when I was like 19. But it didn't occur to me that it's really the same principle now when I'm asking for feedback in my own work as a teacher or as a professional development provider person. I don't need to know, did it work? Yes or no. I need to know how it worked and why it worked, and not just worked by your definition, but worked in terms of my own intentions. So I need to start asking, if I'm talking about my own reading instruction with middle schoolers, when the kids were they talking about text? How could I get them to talk more about the text? Not, was this okay? Are they engaged? Do you think that went well? It's too open-ended, it's too generic, and it leaves us open to these open-ended generic conversations about the thing that matters, that we care about the most, which is the actual instruction. So asking really specifically for feedback on your intention, not on the practice. Yes, you had independent reading, but was everyone reading accurately with a purpose? How do I know what their purposes were? Were their purposes compelling for them? That's what we want to be talking about. So that's what we have to guide other people to be talking and giving us feedback about. In order to do that, you have to think about all of the areas of your instruction and what you thought they were for. So that means sort of taking a list, making a list of the things that are routine for every single day that you're always doing, and the things that are new for a lesson or really intentional for a lesson, and really bringing them back to the key ingredients and saying, how am I using this in order to make sure kids read accurately with a purpose? How am I using this in order to make sure that kids are writing with a purpose to an audience? Because if they're not learning how to write. They're just writing. And although there's some idea that like increasing volume is just good, it's not good by itself. It's only good if kids are reading, are increasing their volume of engaged reading. So that brings me back to another story about the first job that I had as a reading teacher. When the reading department said we want more reading volume, we tried that walk with a book thing. We found that there wasn't really an increase in reading volume, and that kids were kind of walking with any kind of book, including books that they didn't and couldn't really read. So instead, we decided that we would have sustained silent reading time as a school. Now, if you've ever investigated this, you'll know that the research on sustained silent reading can be mixed, but the findings are actually not. So what I mean by that is when you do an intervention study to see if having SSR or not having it works or not, you'll get mixed results. But the finding is actually the same. Engaged reading is always better than not having engaged reading. However, the presence or absence of SSR as a policy doesn't mean anything about whether kids are doing engaged reading or not. You can have engaged readers in schools with no SSR policy. You can have SSR policies where kids engage with very little reading during that SSR time. And for example, we thought the cleanest way to add it into the schedule is to put it between recess and lunch. Between lunch and recess. Now, it's the cleanest place to put it in the schedule, but it was sort of not a place of success for sitting quietly with a book between lunch and recess. And in order to get everybody to do it at the same time, we had to do it in large spaces like the gym or the cafeteria. So we had 15 minutes of XSR between lunch and recess in the gym or the cafeteria. So yes, on the surface, we have sustained silent reading, and we can force children into compliance with sitting quietly with a book open, but we can't force them into engaged reading. So that policy started with a good idea of let's have more opportunities for reading volume, but it ended with being canceled and using that time for something else because we weren't actually focused on the right things. So we have to think about the practices. Just being there or not being there is not good enough. Just because you had a mini lesson doesn't mean it was good instruction. Just because there was independent reading, even if it was long independent reading, even if it was quiet independent reading, doesn't mean that that was a good opportunity for every single kid to develop literacy. So we have to come back to these practices that we do, think about exactly why we do them, and ask ourselves and others how we address these areas in order to make sure those key ingredients are there. Now, it's not all on the teacher to make sure these conversations happen. It's also on the people coming into classrooms, whether they are observers or coaches or evaluators or parents or anybody on the outside of instruction looking in. These are sort of the all-purpose first questions. And it comes back to the checklist idea, but notice I'm not asking whether students are reading and writing, because I know that I can find examples of kids with a pen in their hand that's moving, but it's not good instruction necessarily just because there's a pen in your hand that's moving. So the all-purpose first questions start with reading, writing, and talking, but we're asking, what are they reading and writing? What are they talking about? And our next follow-up question is, how will this efficiently lead to reading, writing, and talking about text in ways that match these key ingredients? I've got a little star here because sometimes there's a moment in the classroom where you don't see reading, writing, or talking. You see explanations being given, or strategies being demonstrated, or movie clips being shown, or background being built. So when you have like a 10-minute check-in, or a walkthrough, or a pop-in, sometimes people call them that. I never understood why they were called pop-ins. I always think about like you should bring popcorn or something when you come for a pop-in, but I don't think that was the idea. Anyway, sometimes people will walk into your room and they don't actually see reading, writing, or talking from the students, but they see something that is actively setting them up for it, efficiently leading to it. And that can count too. So as an evaluator, if you walk in, give teachers the benefit of the doubt. I didn't see the kids reading, writing, or talking when I walked through, but tell me about how what you were doing leads to reading, writing, and talking. And then we can get into the questions about what were they reading about? Did they have a reason for reading? Did they know their reason for reading accurately with a purpose? So these are kind of the all-purpose places to start, because we're really interested not in whether the practices are happening, but how they're happening. So we've talked a little bit today about how you could demonstrate that you are using these key ingredients. We've talked a little bit about how you could find them. If you were walking into a classroom, you ask yourself about them. The last thing I want to leave you with is just an idea about how you can protect them. So goal setting is something that people do in general at the beginning of the year, but it's also something that has become a really big part of just the normal practices of teacher evaluation. And so because it's part of teachers' evaluation in lots of cases, you have like a goal setting template or a sheet, you have a date that you have to set the goal. Goal setting itself has been institutionalized into this routinized practice that is tied to evaluation, which means that sometimes those goals shift and become really strange and weird. And sometimes you are told what your goal should be. I want to float the idea with you today that you could set goals in ways that protect the active ingredients by asking yourselves a short set of questions about these goals when you have the opportunity to set them. And I realize that in some places you're told what your goal should be, but you can always kind of set your own for yourself. The questions are, if I set this goal, what would I be doing monthly, weekly, daily to meet it? Is that the right work to be doing? And again, the right work doesn't look a certain way or sound a certain way. It just means that those active ingredients are there and they're working. And are these things that I might be doing in order to meet the goal important for student learning, which means are those key ingredients there? And what might I need to move out of the way or make more of in order to make room for these tasks to happen? So one thing that we know about goal setting is that it sets and limits what happens in your classroom. And so you want to choose a goal that lets you do more of the things that bring those active ingredients in and less of the other stuff. And maybe asking these questions with your evaluator or just on your own in your head is a way to make that happen. So this is sort of the end of our time together. I put up a couple of resources, which are things that I have written. The recent book is on the left, Making Teacher Evaluation Work. We talk a lot about the ideas in here. There's also a really short article that's just available online called Not Whether But How to Ask the Right Questions. And then if you want to come back to those key ingredients, those are things that I talked about a lot in my first book, Reading's Non-Negotiable. So I hope you take a look at those, and thank you so much for joining me.
Wow, thank you so much, Rachel. You've given us so many light bulb moments during your session about teacher evaluation, no less. So thank you so much for your important work and for speaking to it so brilliantly today. Your work is invaluable to us. We look forward to what your contributions can do for us in the field of education and teacher evaluation specifically. Viewers, I know that you all learned so much as well based on our Twitter feed. So we invite you to contribute to our Padlet. You will find it on the Ed Collab page. I'll go ahead and do my screen share so you can see where to find it now. When you go to the Ed Collab page, we have a banner across the top to add to our Padlet. Once you click on there, you'll be able to see where thinking has been gathered across the day today. And then moving forward, I'd like to preview for you what we have coming up in session 4 today. So let me go ahead and share that with you as well. Continue your learning with us throughout the afternoon. And so in our session 4 workshops, we have 3 strands going. We can pop in on decolonizing bilingual curriculum and pedagogy, deepening independence in the reading workshop, and interrogating text across the day and across the grades. Rachel, thank you again for your work, and we look forward to learning more from you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.